Hello, I'm theoliverpickard and welcome to a gorgeous but incredibly hot Limousin, France. I'm filming this video incredibly early in the morning and that sun is rising hot and fast. But luckily it's only temporary, it's supposed to break tomorrow. And we're going to have nice, beautiful, sunny but cool weather again. So, if you've clicked on this video, you may or may not know what a variant is. Basically, a variant is if you're a successful car company and you make a thing that's already a known product, you've got an engine and a chassis and stuff from a car that sells loads, and you want to make another model, you're daft not to use those parts in another car. And in this video I'm going to share with you 10 of my favourite 2CV variants. That's cars that use 2CV mechanicals and maybe even a couple of 2CV panels, but don't use the vehicle in its entirety. They have their own identity. They're their own vehicle with their own identity, but share DNA, family DNA, with the 2CV. These aren't really in any particular order, they're not chronological or anything like that. They're kind of just in the order that came out of my brain when I was thinking of them. And my first one is actually my favourite 2CV variant of all time. That's a big thing, because I love my 2CV variants and I love my 2CVs. But this particular car is incredibly close to my heart, and it's one I wish they'd made more of because I really want one. And it's the G van. Yes, not the H van. The H van uses traction avant mechanicals, and it's, you know, the French bread van. But the G van was a van that was a prototype made in 1948, and it was a baby H van. And they only made a few of them. They had a 475cc engine taken from a 2CV. They used a modified 2CV chassis. They had 2CV suspension at the front and torsion bars in the back so that they could take the weight. And they were a beautiful little teeny tiny lovely van. They basically look like a mini-me H van. And the reason they didn't make it is because it required all new panels. It required, because it's a shrunken down H van, it couldn't use H van panels and it couldn't use 2CV panels. And even though it had a much better load space than a 2CV van, the 2CV van was cheaper to produce, and so they went with that. There's still one left. Citroen has this really bad habit, or had this really bad habit, of destroying their prototypes. And especially during the Plans Pond days when metal was rationed and all that kind of thing. And unfortunately there's only one left. But if there's any car on this list that I could reproduce and own myself, the G-Van would be on the top of the list. It's a real shame that they didn't produce it, because I can see it being one of the greatest cars ever made up there, you know, with like VW splitters and all that kind of thing. And I really wish they'd made them. But alas, they didn't. The next car on my list is not actually one car. It's a bunch of cars, a family of cars, if you will, that all share the same ethos, all share the same kind of identity, and you could easily at a distance think one was another and that kind of thing. The thing that separates them is time and where they were built. But they were all created for pretty much the same reason, and for that reason they tend to go under kind of the same family umbrella, and so I'm going to treat them as kind of the same car, even though they're not. They all have their own differences and quirks and stuff like that, but it would make a very long, rather boring video, so I'm just going to pile them all in together. And if you own one of these cars, I'm kind of sorry, but I am giving them their due. So in the early 70s, or late 60s actually, 1968, on the Ivory Coast in Africa, a gentleman made a little car called the Baby Bruce. And the Baby Bruce was basically formed under the simple idea of, how can we make a 2CV simpler? Like, can we make a 2CV with less parts? Can we make a 2CV with less stuff? Can we make a 2CV cheaper, tougher, stronger, and easier to produce? And the answer was yes. And the Baby Bruce was so successful, they made 28,000. And from the Baby Bruce was spawned the Dalat, the Namco Pony, the Faff, the Yagan, and the Mungo, amongst a couple of others. And basically, they were made in Chile, Central Africa, Indonesia, Spain, Belgium. They were made all over the world, and these are Greece. The Namco Pony was made in Greece. I recently saw one at the 2CV National, and they are basically, they're like metal Maharis. They're incredibly robust, incredibly simple. Another name that they go under is Faff. Faffs were created in the mid to late 70s in Portugal by Citroen, and that's where the Faff name comes from. And most of these cars actually get referred to as Faffs by a lot of people, and it's kind of wrong because Faffs came kind of later. And Faff stands for Facile à fabriquer, Facile à financer. Basically, easy to construct, easy to pay for. And these cars were made in Vietnam and also it's in all these developing markets, in all these developing countries all over the world, not just by Citroen, but by kind of privateers. And Citroen would give, well, not give, but you know, they would be obviously paid for, but Citroen would produce chassis and mechanical running gear, basically a rolling chassis, to these little private companies who would then create cars for these developing markets. And they were incredibly successful. Each one produced at least like 20,000 units, some even more. They were produced in South America and all sorts, and they're an incredibly amazing little thing, and they're a kind of a lost piece of history in the automotive world, because we don't tend to look at cars produced in Africa, and we don't tend to look at cars produced in South America, because these places speak different languages and from English. That's one of the reasons why I started this YouTube channel more towards 2CVs and stuff, because most of the information for 2CVs is in French, not English. And for the same reason, we don't look at South America, we don't look at or Central America, we don't look at Africa. But these places have incredibly rich automotive histories, and they're kind of cool. And from all that spawned a car which is much closer to home, and which a lot of you will have heard of. Dalat, the Vietnam variant, wanted a car that could get to places where the standard little metal box 2CV couldn't get to. And so they started work on a four-wheel drive Dalat. Citroen, hearing of this, sent a team out to Vietnam. And on returning to France, they started work on the Mahari four-wheel drive. The first Mahari four-wheel drive was produced on May the 23rd of 1979 and continued production until 1983. They have a different bumper and they have the spare tyre on the bonnet, so they're very easy to see at a distance. And they're 29 horsepower, and they use a very different, they don't have two engines like a 2CV Safari, they have kind of a linkage and a gearbox arrangement, but they don't have a centre diff like a modern four-wheel drive does. And 1,213 were made in total, and not all of them were plastic. They made some for the French police and the military and stuff that were metal, so they actually returned back to their kind of Dalat roots. And you could look at them as kind of, they came from a metal box car, then they turned to plastic little French beach cars, and then they went on to be metal cars again, and that's kind of cool. But yeah, they were cool, but they struggled with their weight, because obviously adding a big plastic body and the frame that goes underneath the plastic body, and then adding loads of four-wheel drive gubbins, put a lot of strain on that little 29 horsepower engine. But even so, they could go up inclines of up to 40%, which is pretty good considering they had quite a long wheelbase. Now then, going to one of the more French and one of the first actually 2CV variants. In 1961, Bertoni penned a car which he would later call his favourite design ever, and that little car was the Ami 6, which would be in production until 1969. It had a 602 M4 engine, which is Jolene's engine. It doesn't have the ports that are spaced out like this. It has ports that are together, and the exhaust goes over the front, but it is a 602. And it was an absolutely incredible and insane design, and it was one of the first cars ever, along with one of the Ford Taunus cars, that didn't have round headlights, and that made it illegal in America, because until I think it was 1975, any car with non-round headlights was completely illegal in America. So they actually made round headlight variations for America, which have bigger headlights as well. In fact, one of my, two of my friends, Chuck and Paul, have one of the very, very rare American spec Ami 6s. And they're really, really cool little cars and very, very beautiful. And they have one of, well, in fact, they have the best 2CV interior ever produced. I'm just going to say that. From a bizarre French little car to a bizarre Chilean little car, the Citroen Etta. The Citroen Etta is a really cool little variant, and they were made from 1953 until 1979. They were made in Chile and Argentina, and the chassis and engines, just like the Namcos and the Darats and all that, came from France as a kind of a rolling chassis engine gearbox arrangement. They arrived in Chile and Argentina, who made the bodywork. And because they made the bodywork, they were able to respond to what the Chilean and Argentinian people needed. And what the Chilean and Argentinian people said they needed wasn't a soft top. They're like, we don't want a soft top, and we also have livestock and stuff like that, and we don't want to put our livestock in the back of the car with us. So we need a saloon with a removable boot, and that's what they created. The Citroen Ettas are hard tops, and the car's kind of cut in here, and it has a little separate boot on the back. They're a totally unique thing to South America, and they produced tons of them. In fact, the Chileans referred to them as the French miracle, because they kind of mobilized Chile. And it was said at one point that there wasn't a Chilean person who hadn't been in or driven a Citroen Etta, which I kind of love. And like I say, they're kind of close to me, because one of the first people to support this channel when I started doing car stuff were actually the Chilean Citroen Etta clubs. And I'm very thankful for that. And the boot and the hardtop only added 5 kilos to the car, so they performed exceedingly well. They did an incredible job of actually redesigning a car and only adding 5 kilos, even though it had a hardtop. And they also made a pickup, which I would imagine is rather lighter and looks very different from the British-made pickups. Oh, British-made pickups, you say? Oh yes. 2CVs were also produced in Britain, and these 2CVs are referred to as Slough 2CVs. And one of the most interesting things about the Slough 2CVs, they made a standard 2CV that looks like a 1950s 2CV, only it has a bonnet badge and opening rear windows. They also have like a posher roof and a nicer interior. They were too expensive, and they killed them off. They stopped making them because simply it actually ended Citroen UK, because nobody bought them, because they took an incredible simple little car and they kind of tried to make it more luxury before people were ready for that, and before people were ready to pay for that in post-war UK. But Citroen UK did spawn an amazing thing. They made a little pickup. And one day an admiral was walking past a Citroen dealership in Portsmouth and saw one. And that admiral looked at that little car and he thought, we could use that. And they were used by the Royal Marines on HMS Bulwark. I think I'm saying that right. It's B-U-L-W-A-R-K, Bulwark. And later on the Alberon. And they were used because you don't think of a 2CV being a very good military vehicle, but they were actually used by the French military as well. But not the Slough examples. The Slough examples only used by the British Royal Marines. And the reason they were used is because they could be picked up by a Westland Whirlwind helicopter, and popped on a beach. And because they're so good off-road, they could pretty much conquer anything. And if need be, the Marines could actually jump out of it and pick it up to move it over obstacles rather than kind of having to move the log out of the way. You could just lift the car over the log. And so there are actually a few 2CVs knocking about around the world that have kind of a 50 cal machine gun mount, or whatever the British version of a 50 cal machine gun is. The HMS, I'm going to butcher this name again, Bulwark had 42 of the little blighters on board, and the Albaron had 35. And the helicopters were part of the 845 RNS brigade, or if you're into military history, you'll be able to look that group of soldiers up. But yeah, super cool little cars, and there are some amazing photographs from back in the day of these little 2CVs being plucked off aircraft carriers and slung on the beaches in Malaysia. But Citroen UK didn't just produce military pickups and bizarre luxury little 2CV saloons. They also made their own car from scratch, which is perhaps even more bizarre and cool than the military pickups. And it was called the Bijou. The Bijou was made from 1959 until 1964, and they made just 211 of them. And the idea was, they took a 2CV for a drive and they thought, this is really cool. Imagine if this was like a sporty little car. And so they made a fiberglass shell for the 2CV and plonked it on top. And it made this kind of cool little coupe saloon body. And the hope was that it would be lighter and more aerodynamic than the standard 2CV and make it go quickly. The problem with that is fiberglass in the 50s was kind of at its early stages of development. It was a state-of-the-art aerospace material. And so by the time they'd finished making it, it was actually heavier than the standard 2CV, and so they made a sports car that was slower than the standard car. And that worked for VW and the Carman Ghia, but it didn't, unfortunately, work for Citroen UK and the Bijou. And the Bijou, like I said, they only made 211 of them. You would think that Bijous are like massively prized and worth an absolute fortune like the 2CV Maharis, but I was shocked to find out, actually, while I was researching this video, that even though collectors adore them, they're not actually worth that much money. And I think that's just because not very many people either know what they are or know they exist. Now then, back to France. By far and away the most successful single variant of the 2CV ever produced was the Dian, made from 1967 until 1983. They made over 1.44 million of them, and they definitely deserve respect of their own. Although for some reason, for a long time, they've kind of been overshadowed by the 2CV. I think that they're finally getting the respect that they deserve. They were sold with 4 different engines. The very first ones came with a 425cc engine. It's a faster version of the engine Jolene has. The Jolene has 18 horsepower, and the Dians actually had 21 to cope with the extra weight. But they produced those cars for just 5 months, and then they moved on to the M4 engine. The M4 engine is the engine that was in the AMI 6, which is basically a 602 version of this engine. They were produced for just 10 months, and then after that, the regular Dian 6 and Dian 4s were produced. The Dian 4s have a 435cc engine, and the Dian 6, of course, has the modern 602, or rather the later 602. But they always received more power than their 2CV counterparts, and they were always kind of a bit more fancy, and they were seen as more of a deluxe version of a 2CV. They were created to replace the 2CV if possible. It didn't happen because people just loved their 2CVs too much. But they still sold absolutely tons of them. And they came in 2 different models, the Luxe and the Comfort. The Comfort, it being the posher version, and available for a few £100 more, has moulded plastic door cards, vinyl covered hardboard, and a slightly nicer steering wheel. And if you want to see more of the Dian on this channel, I did a 1974 versus 1963 2CV versus Dian video, which Dian people got really mad about, even though I don't know why, because I love Dians, they're really cool. And actually, I have to say, nowadays, 2CVs are incredibly expensive, and Dians are cheaper, which is bizarre because they were created to be the posher thing. So actually you can get the posher thing for less money, and if you are looking for 2-cylinder air-cooled Citroen fun, you can't really go wrong with a Dian at the minute. They are an absolute bargain. And Dians and square lights. On to the next one, and our little friends, the Amis. In 1969, when the Ami 6 was killed off and the Ami 8 was announced, there was a little car in development that was supposed to be an Ami sports car. And in 1973, it was brought to public attention and the first cars were produced. And that car was the Ami Super. The Ami Super had the 1015cc engine from the Citroen GS, which is the car that fits in between the DS and the Amis. It's kind of a midway between, and it has a flat 4-cylinder air-cooled engine. Now then, the 1015cc engine in the GS wasn't much to write home about because the GS is kind of a big car. But when it was taken out of the GS and plonked in an Ami, it became quite the little hot rod because it gave a 67% increase in power. And with that came a different gearbox from the GS with much bigger brakes and a floor-mounted gear change. So you can actually see an Ami Super from quite a distance away. As soon as you spot that floor-mounted gear shift, she's a Super. And they were pretty quick little things. And the coolest thing about the Ami Super is they made an estate, which fast cars are cool, but fast estates are even cooler. But that wasn't the only fast Ami. Believe it or not, NSU, which is a German company that later became Audi, were messing around with Wankel rotary engines, which instead of having engines that have pistons and move like that, or like that, or like that, they rotate round. And they were messing about with these Wankel rotaries, and Citroen saw an opportunity, and so they created a company together called Co-Motor, which produced rotary engines. And so the rotary NSUs, like the NSU Rotary Pre and the NS RO80, were produced by NSU. But Citroen also got use of those rotaries, and one of the results of that was the M35. The M35 is a rotary engined Ami 8, which is perhaps the weirdest Citroen ever made. They made them from 1969 until 1971, and they have a 995cc rotary, and they're even faster than the Ami Super, producing 49 brake horsepower and having a 0 to 60 in 19 seconds. They made 267 of them, and they were sold to really good Citroen customers. Every single car is actually numbered on the outside. And it was quite a weird arrangement because the way the arrangement worked was, when the arrangement was finished, when the contract with it was kind of a development program that was run with customers. It's kind of a bizarre thing. But when that arrangement was over, the owners could either hand the cars back to Citroen, who would destroy them. Again, why Citroen? Why? Or the owners could keep them, and thankfully a decent amount of the owners kept them, and there are still a few left. Many more than people say are left, I think. Because I've seen like car storage racks full of them. There are collectors out there that have multiple M35s. And they look like an Ami 8, but they've got kind of a slashed off coupe back, and they have an ABS plastic nose cone that's more aerodynamic, and little square headlights. And they're a bizarre creation and a bizarre part of Citroen history, and I don't know where this thing of Citroen kind of going to get their rare cars and crushing them comes from. During the B-Class rally era of Citroen, when Citroen created the BX 4TC, which was their B-class rally car homologation special. When they did rallying back in the day, they had to produce a certain amount of cars for sale as well as cars for competition. And when they created the Citroen BX rally cars, later on Citroen actually sneakily went back, tried to find all the BXs that they could buy off owners and crush them. It's kind of an odd thing, and Citroen have this thing of trying to kill off their old cars, and I think it's just because their old cars are so good. And it's one of the reasons why scrappage schemes or cash for clunkers schemes were invented, to get rid of little 2CVs, because when we have such lovely little reliable and economical and endlessly repairable and rebuildable and environmentally friendly fantastic little beans like Jolene, why would we go out and buy a brand new car that's all made of plastic? Even Citroen made a rod for their own back, building the 2CV and the 2CV variants. If you have a 2CV variant, make sure you send me pictures. I love hearing about your guys' cars, so make sure you contact me on the social medias. That being said, if you have a comment, please leave it down below. I always respond to any comment I can. And you guys always lit them all over social media, and I have to go chasing for them. Please, if you've got a comment, please leave it down below. It makes my life so much easier and means I can spend less time chasing down people's comments, because I have this thing. I have to read all your guys' comments. I have to respond, because you guys put time and effort into sending me emails and writing these lovely comments. So thank you all for doing that. Thank you to everyone who shares these videos. It really, really helps this channel, and thank you for all your support. Make sure you tell me if you like this video by clicking like down below. It also lets YouTube know that I exist, because I don't think they know. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to this channel, and there's a little bell icon, so if you want to receive a notification so you don't miss one of these videos, if it just doesn't appear in your subscriptions or whatever, if it doesn't pop up in your YouTube feed, if you click that little bell icon down there, you'll get a little notification. Oliver has uploaded a new video every time I upload one of these videos. But I upload these videos regularly on Wednesdays and Saturdays, so you know when to look for me. Thank you all for watching. Please be awesome to each other, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
We'll fill the space within what might have been with what happens today.